The moment Myrtle Keating fired her rifle at the rattlesnake coiled 3 inches from a stranger's boot, and saved his life without so much as flinching. She had no idea that the man she had rescued would become the greatest argument against her long-held belief that she needed nobody at all. The year was 1882, and the town of Dustfall, Texas, sat like a stubborn old mule at the edge of nowhere, baking under a sun that showed no mercy and collecting dust the way other towns collected reputation. It was not a pretty place, but it was honest, and Myrtle Keating respected honest things more than pretty ones. She had come to Dustfall 3 years prior with a deed to 40 acres of hardpan land, a mule named Goliath who had an attitude problem, a trunk of tools, and the particular kind of silence that follows a woman who has already lost everything once and decided it would never happen again. She was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and sun-brown, with dark hair she wore in a single braid down her back and hands that had blistered and calloused and healed so many times they had become something close to leather. She had built her own house. Not hired someone to build it, not sweet-talked a neighbor into raising walls. She had quarried the plans from a book she had borrowed from the general store, and she had done it herself, board by board, nail by nail, through 2 seasons of weather and one particularly ugly winter that had tried its hardest to break her and failed. She kept a garden that grew more from sheer stubbornness than from favorable soil, and she ran 20 head of cattle with the efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for help that wasn't coming. The people of Dustfall respected her the way you respect a mountain, from a reasonable distance, with quiet awe and without much expectation of warmth. The women in town had tried for the first year to draw her into quilting circles and church socials, and Myrtle had attended a handful of times, sitting at the edges of things, smiling politely and leaving early. The men had tried other approaches, a few of them respectable and a few of them considerably less so, and she had handled all of them with the same calm efficiency she applied to everything else. She was not unkind. She was simply complete in a way that made other people feel both impressed and vaguely unnecessary. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when she was riding the fence line along the western edge of her property, checking for breaks after a storm had come through the night before with considerable opinions about the state of the territory. The air still smelled like rain and sage, and the sky had that particular wash-clean blue that only exists in the hour after a storm, the kind of blue that makes even cynical people feel briefly hopeful. Myrtle was not especially cynical, but she was practical, and she was squinting at a section of wire that had come loose from its post when she heard voices on the road. Not voices, a single voice, low and even, talking to a horse the way people do when they want the horse to know that everything is fine while privately suspecting that nothing is. She straightened in her saddle and looked toward the road, and that was when she saw the man crouched beside the wheel of a broken-down wagon, and the rattlesnake that had decided the shadow of that wagon was an excellent place to be. The snake was a western diamondback, thick and irritated, its rattle going like a tiny furious drum. The man had gone very still, his eyes on the snake with the focused calm of someone who understood the situation perfectly and was quietly calculating odds. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean, and weathered the way men get who spend most of their time outdoors, wearing a plain brown duster that had seen better days and a hat that had seen even worse ones. He had not reached for the pistol at his hip because reaching for the pistol at his hip would have meant moving, and moving was exactly what the snake was waiting for. Myrtle raised her Winchester, took one breath, and fired. The snake's head separated from the rest of it with a decisive crack that echoed off the flat land in all directions. The man sat very still for one more second, then let out a long, slow breath and turned to look at where the shot had come from. He found Myrtle Keating sitting her horse about 30 yards off, her rifle still raised, smoke drifting from the barrel. "Much obliged," he said. "The snake would have struck in another second," she said, lowering the Winchester and resting it across her saddle. "You were doing well to hold still, but still doesn't beat dead at that range." "I know," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that told her he was not insulted, just honest. He stood up slowly, the way a man does when his legs have been locked in one position for too long, and he took off his hat and ran a hand through dark hair that needed cutting. "Ira Finley," he said, nodding at her the way people do when they have no hand to shake because the hand is holding a hat. "Myrtle Keating," she said. "What's wrong with your wheel?" He looked back at the wagon as though he had almost forgotten it was there. The front left wheel had come off clean, the axle resting in the dirt, and the wagon itself was tilted at a miserable angle with a load of lumber on it that was in imminent danger of deciding to be somewhere else. "Came loose on a rock I didn't see in the dark," he said. "I was trying to make Dustfall before last night's storm hit and I didn't quite manage it. Where are you coming from?" "Abilene by way of everywhere else," he said, and there was a note in his voice she couldn't quite name, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had been carried a long way. She looked at the wagon, looked at the wheel, looked at the lumber. She calculated the way she always calculated, quickly and without sentiment. He was on the road that ran alongside her western property line, which meant he was still about 2 miles from town, and the sun was going to be serious business by mid-morning. The wheel could be fixed, but not by one person without a jack, and she had a jack in her barn. "Come with me," she said. She did not wait to see if he was surprised by the offer. She turned her horse back toward her property and heard his footsteps behind her, then the soft sound of his horse's hooves as he untied the animal from the wagon and followed. Her property in the morning light was, she knew, a different thing than her property in the harsh noon sun. The garden was still damp from the storm, the tomatoes and beans gleaming, and the house she had built sat solid and square in the middle of it, all with the particular satisfaction of a thing made by hand. She watched Ira Finley's face as he took it in, the way people's faces always changed when they saw what she had done here, and she saw his expression settle into something that looked like genuine appreciation rather than the patronizing surprise she had come to expect. "You built that yourself," he said. "I did. It's a good house," he said simply, and then he followed her to the barn without saying anything else about it. They worked together to get the jack loaded onto her smaller cart, and she hitched Goliath to it while Ira handled the equipment with the quiet competence of someone who knew what he was doing with tools. He did not try to take over. He did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. He just worked alongside her, handing her things when she reached for them, moving out of the way when she needed the space, asking 1 or 2 practical questions about the jack's mechanism and listening carefully to the answers. When they got back to the wagon, the job of getting the wheel back on was awkward but manageable. Myrtle operated the jack while Ira guided the wheel onto the axle, and the whole operation took about 40 minutes in the building heat of the morning. She noticed, without particularly meaning to, that he was stronger than he looked, that his hands were scarred in the way of someone who had worked hard for a long time, and that when he disagreed with one of her approaches to the axle pin, he said so plainly and was right. And when she pointed out that the wheel's rim was cracked on one side and was going to give him trouble before he made it to town, he nodded and examined it and agreed and thanked her. "You can limp it to the wheelwright in town," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "Tell Caldwell the crack is on the inner rim and he'll know what it needs." "Thank you," Ira Finley said, and he looked at her directly when he said it, not the way men usually looked at her, which was either with the speculative calculation of someone assessing an unmarried woman and her property, or with the slightly uncomfortable deference of someone who didn't quite know what to do with her. He looked at her the way one capable person looks at another. It was such a simple thing, and it moved her in a way she was not prepared for. "Where are you headed?" She asked because it was a reasonable question, and because she was curious in spite of herself. "I'm looking at a piece of land east of town," he said. "A rancher named Hollies is selling off the south quarter of his spread. I've been working other men's cattle for 6 years, and I'd like to try my hand at my own. Hollies' south quarter is decent grazing land," she said. The water situation is manageable if you know where the spring is. He'll try to tell you it's dried up, but it hasn't." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because I rode that property 2 years ago when I was considering buying it myself," she said. "I had good reasons for deciding against it, but the spring not being there wasn't one of them." "What were the reasons?" he asked, and his tone was not pushy, just genuinely curious. "The southern fence line has a standing dispute with a man named Dormer who owns the property below it," she said. "He's been litigating over the boundary for a decade, and he will be litigating for another decade unless someone comes to an agreement with him. He's not a bad man, just a stubborn one, and if you go in with the same posture Holly's used, which was essentially one of aggressive indifference, you'll have the same problem Holly's had." Ira Finley stood very still for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has just received information worth considerably more than he expected. Then he said, "Would you be willing to tell me the rest of what you know about it over a cup of coffee? If you're not too busy. I realize I've already taken up most of your morning." Myrtle considered the question. The fence line was checked. The cattle were in good shape. The garden didn't need tending today. And there was something about this man, something about the way he had said it's a good house, without making it a compliment about her, and without making it a surprise, that made her want to continue the conversation in a way she hadn't wanted to continue a conversation in a very long time. "I have coffee on," she said. They sat at her kitchen table, which she had also built herself, and she told him what she knew about Holly's land and Dormer's dispute, and the water situation, and the general composition of the soil on the eastern side of Dustfall. And he listened with the focused attention of someone for whom this information was valuable, and also, she suspected, with the attention of someone who simply found listening to her interesting. The coffee went cold, and she put it on the stove again, and they talked about cattle breeds and the particular challenges of the Texas climate and the railroad's effects on the cattle market. And before she entirely registered how it had happened, 2 hours had passed, and she had told him more about herself and her land and her thinking than she had told most people in Dustfall in 3 years. She noticed it and pulled back slightly, sitting straighter in her chair, and becoming aware that she had been leaning forward with her elbows on the table the way she only did when she was completely comfortable, and comfort was something she rationed carefully. "I need to get back to work," she said. "Of course," he said, and he stood up immediately and picked up his cup and brought it to the wash basin without being asked, which was such a small thing, and yet he put his hat on. "Thank you, Myrtle, for the snake and the jack and the coffee and the knowledge. I'm in your debt considerably." "You're not in my debt," she said. "I don't run accounts like that." He smiled at that, and it was a good smile, the kind that started in the eyes before it reached the mouth. "No," he said, "I expect you don't." He left, driving the wounded wagon toward town at a careful pace, and Myrtle stood in her doorway and watched him go, and then turned back to her day with the businesslike efficiency of a woman who had things to do, and was not going to spend the rest of the morning thinking about a man with a good smile. She spent approximately 45 minutes thinking about him before she successfully redirected her attention to the task of mending the loose section of fence. Ira Finley was in Dustfall for 3 days before Myrtle saw him again, and she knew this because the town was small enough that people's movements were common knowledge whether you were interested or not, and she was emphatically not interested, which she told herself several times while receiving various reports from the post mistress, Mrs. Clara Hutchins, who had an opinion about everything and the voice to project it. Ira had bought Holly's South Quarter, having apparently arranged a meeting with Dormer within his first afternoon in town, and come to an agreement about the boundary line so quickly and amicably that even Holly's was surprised. He had taken a room at the boarding house run by the Ware family, and he had been seen at the lumber yard, at the general store, at the office of the land surveyor, and at the wheelwright's, where his wheel had been repaired, and the wheelwright, a man named Caldwell, had told anyone who would listen that the new man coming through had known exactly what was wrong before he'd even looked at it, and that someone must have told him. On the fourth day, Myrtle rode into town for supplies, as she did every Thursday, and found Ira Finley at the general store in a conversation with the owner, Mr. Beaumont, about fencing materials. He saw her when she came in and nodded with the specific warmth of someone who is genuinely pleased to see a person, rather than the automatic social warmth of polite acquaintance. She nodded back and went to collect her order from the counter. "Miss Keating," Mr. Beaumont said, "Mr. Finley here was asking about the best supplier for barbed wire, and I told him you'd know better than anyone." Myrtle set down the tin of coffee she was examining and said, "Reynolds in Abilene is better priced than anything you'll find closer, but if you need it in the next 2 weeks you'll want Garfield in Fredericksburg because Reynolds takes 6 weeks for delivery." "I need it in 10 days, Ira said. "Fredericksburg then. Ask for the 14 gauge, not the 12. The 12 looks stouter but it rusts faster in this climate." "How do you know all of this?" he asked, and again there was no condescension in it, just genuine curiosity. "Because I've made every possible mistake on this land and learned from all of them," she said. "It's an efficient education system." He laughed at that, a real laugh, quiet but genuine, and Mr. Beaumont looked between them with the bright-eyed attention of a man who was going to have a great deal to say to his wife later. "Can I carry those to your wagon?" Ira asked, nodding at the pile of goods accumulating on the counter. "I can carry my own things," she said. "I know you can," he said, without any hint of deflation or wounded pride. "I was asking if you'd let me help anyway. It looks heavy." She looked at him for a moment. "It is heavy," she said. "Yes, all right." They loaded her wagon together in the street, while the Thursday morning bustle of Dustfall moved around them, and she was sharply aware of how it must look to the people of this town, the widow Keating, as some of them still thought of her even though she had never been anyone's widow, and had simply been alone for reasons she did not explain to anyone, accepting help from the new man. She could feel the observations happening around her like small, quiet earthquakes. "You know people are watching," she said. "I noticed," he said, lifting a 50-pound sack of grain like it was nothing and settling it in the wagon bed with easy precision. "Does that bother you?" "It depends on what they're seeing," she said. He straightened and looked at her. "What are you worried they're seeing?" "A woman who might be becoming predictable," she said, and she meant it as a mild deflection and was surprised when it came out sounding more honest than that. He considered that with what she was already beginning to recognize as his habitual thoughtfulness, the way he gave questions their actual weight before answering them. "I think predictable people don't shoot rattlesnakes off strangers' boots," he said. "I think you're safe." She found herself smiling despite everything. She turned away before it became something he could read too much into. The weeks that followed were a study in the particular and frustrating experience of a person discovering that someone else has gotten under their skin without using any of the usual methods. Ira Finley did not flatter her. He did not bring her flowers or employ any of the clumsy courtship strategies she had become practiced at deflecting. He simply kept appearing in the natural course of things, at the general store, at the church social she attended once a month out of a genuine if complicated faith, at the road between their two properties, which were closer than she entirely wished they were now that she thought about it. And every time he appeared he talked to her the way you talk to someone you genuinely like, with interest and directness and occasional humor that was never performed. He asked her questions about her land that were real questions, not excuses to talk to her, and when she answered them he used the information, which was the most respectful thing she could imagine. He lent her his second draft horse without hesitation when Goliath went lame for a week, dropping the horse off in her yard with a note that said simply, "His name is Abraham. He is stubborn but honest. Ira." She had stood in the yard holding that note and felt something shift in her chest in a way she did not have a comfortable name for. She told herself she was not interested. She told herself she had built a life that was complete on its own terms and that no amount of dark hair and quiet competence was going to rearrange it. She had built her house. She had built her herd. She had built herself. After what had happened in Kansas 3 years before she came to Dustfall, the brief and catastrophic marriage to a man named Robert Keating who had been charming and interested before the wedding and afterward had been something else entirely. Something that had used her strength against her by calling it stubbornness, and used her intelligence against her by calling it insubordination, and who had left her with nothing when he walked out. Nothing except the particular diamond-hard clarity that comes to a person who survives being told repeatedly that they are too much and decides to become even more. She didn't talk about Robert Keating. Not to anyone in Dustfall, and especially not to herself if she could help it. She had come west and she had built and she had become Myrtle Keating of Dustfall, Texas, who needed nobody and managed everything, and whose reputation for competence was so firmly established that people drove 30 miles to ask her advice about cattle and soil. It was a good life. It was enough. She was thinking this, specifically this, one October afternoon when she was sitting on her porch in the late light with a cup of tea, and watching the sun go down over her 40 acres, the ones she had sweated and bled for, the ones no one could take from her. When she heard the sound of a horse on the road and looked up to see Ira Finley riding toward her property line with his hat pushed back on his head and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. He pulled up at the fence and she stood up from her chair, setting her cup down and walked to meet him because the expression was worth investigating. "There's trouble," he said. There was a fire on the Dormer property, not a catastrophic one but serious, burning through the dry scrub on the eastern edge and moving toward both his property and hers with the cheerful indifference that fire has about property lines. He had come from that direction and had seen it building. He had already sent a rider into town to ring the bell, but it would take time for men to come out, and in the meantime the wind was from the west, and that meant the fire would come east toward both their properties. Myrtle did not waste time. She was back in her house in 40 seconds and out again in 2 minutes with tools, and a wet canvas sack she kept prepared for exactly this kind of emergency fire in dry country was not an if but a when, and she had learned that from painful experience. She had fire breaks on her property that she had dug and maintained carefully, but the western edge near the road was less protected, and that was where the fire would come first. They worked side by side in the failing light, beating down the scrub along the road edge and throwing dirt and working the fire breaks, and later more men arrived from town, and they worked through the dark with lanterns and shouts, and by midnight the fire was contained, and the damage on Myrtle's property was a scorched acre of grassland that would grow back and nothing more. Ira had worked the whole time without stopping, without complaint, and near the end when a burning branch rolled off a pile of dead brush onto her arm, and she hissed with pain, and he reached over and wrapped his bandana around it with a gentleness that had nothing of hesitation in it. She felt something she recognized and did not want to feel. She got home at 1 in the morning and sat at her kitchen table in the dark with her burned arm and her unruly feelings, and she stayed there for a long time. The next morning he came to check on her arm, which was not badly burned but was sore and ugly, and she answered the door with her usual composure and let him in because to not let him in when he had worked beside her all night would have been ungracious, and she was not ungracious. He brought a jar of salve that the town doctor had sent along, apparently having told Ira to deliver it, and she applied it herself while he sat across the table and told her about how Dormer's fire had started, a lantern knocked over in the barn, nothing malicious, just bad luck. They drank coffee. They talked about the damage assessment. They talked about the fire breaks and what improvements might be made. And then there was a pause in the conversation that lasted a few seconds longer than a practical pause, and Ira Finley looked at her across the table with something open in his face that she had been carefully not seeing for 6 weeks. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, because she had found that direct men were better than circling ones, and she had not yet decided what kind of man he was, but the direct approach to finding out seemed most efficient. "I like you very much," he said. "I have liked you since the morning you shot that snake off my boot and didn't see any reason to make a moment of it. I think you are the most genuinely capable and interesting person I have met in a very long time, and I'm aware that's not a conventional thing to say to a woman, but I don't think conventional is what you want." She looked at him steadily. Her arm was throbbing. The morning light was coming through the window she had built herself. She thought about Robert Keating, and then she thought about this man who had asked about the wheel's crack and listened carefully and never once looked at her with anything that resembled possession. "I have managed everything in my life alone," she said. "I built this house alone. I run this land alone. I don't need—" She stopped and she started again more honestly. "I have built myself into someone who needs nothing. I did that deliberately. I don't want to undo it." He nodded. He didn't look hurt. He looked like he understood. "I know that," he said. "I can see what you've built here and I can see what it cost to build it, and I have no intention of asking you to tear any of it down." He paused. "I'm just asking if you want company." The words went into the room and sat there. Company, not rescue, not dependence, not the reshaping of herself into something that fit neatly alongside him, just company. She was quiet for a long moment. "What does that mean exactly in your understanding of it?" she said. "It means I come around when you'll have me," he said. "It means I help when you need it and I don't offer when you don't. It means I eat your terrible cooking." He paused at her expression and allowed himself a slight smile. "That was a gamble, I realize. What I mean is I sit at your table and you sit at mine and we see what that becomes." "My cooking is not terrible," she said. "I have not yet sampled it," he said. "So technically neither of us knows." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Thursday I'm making a beef stew. You can come for supper and then we'll both know." She watched him understand that this was a yes. Not a grand yes, not a declaration, just a yes. "I will let this exist and we will see what it is." And she watched him receive it without triumph or self-congratulation, just with the quiet warmth of someone who had been offered something they wanted and knew better than to make too much of it. "Thursday," he said, and he put his hat on and he left, and Myrtle Keating sat at her kitchen table with her burned arm and her coffee, and the particular electric quality of a morning that had just become different from the morning before it. The beef stew, which she made on Thursday with the specific intention of proving a point, was excellent. She knew it was excellent because she had learned to cook under practical necessity, and had become good at it in the way she had become good at everything she did, which was through relentless iteration. Ira arrived at her door at 6 o'clock with a bottle of good whiskey and a small wrapped package that turned out to be a paper of good tobacco, which she did not smoke, but which she recognized as a thoughtful and non-presumptuous gift. He had no way of knowing her preferences in such things, and he had chosen something practical and non-sentimental that she could decide to use or not, and even the choosing of the gift was characteristic of him in a way that she was starting to catalog. She put the tobacco on the shelf and poured 2 small glasses of the whiskey and they sat down to eat. He ate the stew with the genuine appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for too long, and somewhere in the middle of the meal he looked up and said, "This is not terrible at all." "I told you," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I apologize for the implication." "You don't sound very sorry," she said. "I am sorry about the implication," he said. "I am not sorry about being here to find out it was wrong." They talked through the meal and they talked after it, as they seemed to always do, easily and without effort, and she noticed again how rare that was. How rare it was to be in conversation that felt like the natural movement of 2 equal minds, rather than the negotiation of 2 competing social requirements. He told her about himself that night in ways he hadn't before, about growing up in Missouri, about the father who had been a good farmer and a difficult man, about the 7 years he had spent moving through cattle country, learning every aspect of the trade with the deliberate intention of eventually owning his own piece of it, about the woman in Abilene he had thought he might marry and hadn't, not from heartbreak, but from the gradual mutual recognition that they were not suited. "What made you unsuited?" she asked. "She needed things I didn't know how to give," he said. "Not material things, I could have provided those. She needed someone who was always present in a certain way, always attending, always," he searched for the word, "focused on her as the center of things, and I'm not built that way. I get absorbed in work. I get absorbed in problems. I would have made her unhappy, and I had enough self-knowledge to understand that." "That's an unusually honest self-assessment," she said. "I've had time to think about it," he said. "What about you?" She was quiet for a moment. She did not owe him the story. But she told it, the condensed version, and she told it plainly, without the particular note of bitterness she had noticed in her own voice sometimes when the subject came close. She told him about Robert Keating and what that marriage had been and how she had left it and come west. She did not ask for sympathy. She stated it as fact, the way she stated everything. Ira listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That man was a fool." "He was not a fool," she said. "He was exactly what he was. I was the fool for not seeing it." "You were 23 and you trusted someone you had reason to trust," he said. "That's not foolish. That's human." "I prefer not to be human about things that cost me that much," she said, and she meant it as a wry observation and was surprised when it came out sounding more like a wound. He looked at her for a long moment. "That sounds like a lot of work," he said quietly. "Not being human about things." She did not answer that. She refilled his whiskey glass and turned the conversation to the winter grazing schedule, and he let her change it, which was exactly the right thing to do. He left at 9 o'clock because it was a working distance from his place and they both had early mornings. At the door he stopped and said, "Thank you for supper, Myrtle, and for the rest of it." "I'll come check your fencing on Saturday," she said. "If you're serious about starting the herd before winter, you need to know where your gaps are." "I'm serious," he said. "Saturday." She closed the door behind him and stood in her hallway in the lamplight and felt the house around her, which was hers entirely and which she loved with a fierce, quiet pride, and felt something new inside the house too, something that was not the house but was not unwelcome. November came to Dustfall like a change of mind. The heat broke suddenly over a long weekend and gave way to cool blue mornings and the particular dry cold of Texas autumn that is not harsh but is honest, and the land shifted color from brown to a kind of pale gold. Myrtle had her cattle in good order for winter, her stores laid up, her firewood stacked in the shed beside the house. She had done all of this over the previous weeks while also riding out to Ira's property on 2 occasions, to assess his fencing and water situation, and talk through the logistics of his planned herd purchase. And he had come to her for supper twice more. And in between these meetings, they had fallen into a habit of crossing paths on the road that she suspected was slightly less accidental than it appeared. She thought about this during the cold mornings while she was feeding cattle or working in the winter garden, turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. She was not afraid of her feelings exactly, but she was afraid of what feelings led to, which was dependence, and dependence led to the vulnerability that had made the Kansas years possible. She was not going back to Kansas, not metaphorically, not in any form, and yet, she was sitting with the yet one afternoon in early November when Clara Hutchins came down the road in her buggy at a pace that suggested urgency and pulled up at Myrtle's fence with an expression that confirmed it. "There's been trouble at the Finley place," she said. Myrtle was on her horse in under 4 minutes. What had happened was this. A man named Coles, who was employed by a larger cattle operation out of San Antonio that had been gradually and illegally pressuring smaller landholders in the area to sell, had ridden onto Ira's new property the night before and destroyed the surveyor's stakes that marked the southern boundary, the ones that confirmed the agreement with Dormer and that Ira had spent considerable legal effort establishing. It was not a violent act, but it was a deliberate one, and it was not the first time Coles had done something similar in the area. Two other small ranchers had already sold out to the San Antonio operation after similar pressures, and there was a pattern that everyone in Dustfall could see and nobody had yet successfully challenged. She found Ira at his property line with the county surveyor, a man named Pratt, examining what remained of the markers. He was controlled and quiet in the way that she had come to understand meant he was actually angry, a contained fire kind of anger, and when he saw her he said, "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said, and dismounted and looked at the damage. "Who's your lawyer?" "I don't have one yet." "You need Harrison in Fredericksburg," she said. "He handled something similar for a rancher named Tibbetts 4 years ago, and he knows the land law in this county better than anyone. He's expensive, but he's good." "How expensive?" "More than you want to spend," she said honestly, "but less than your land is worth." He looked at her for a moment. The wind was cold and the light was flat and gray and his jaw was set. "I knew there was a risk when I bought this parcel," he said. "Holly's warned me the San Antonio people had been interested in the area." "Holly should have been clearer about it," she said flatly. "He told me enough that I knew it was possible," Ira said. He was being fair to Holly's, she noticed, even annoyed as he was. "I made the decision with my eyes open." "Then keep them open now," she said. "Coles and whoever is directing him are counting on you to feel isolated and pressured. If you act quickly and legally and make it clear you're not moving, they'll probably redirect their attention. It's the people who hesitate that they focus on." "How do you know this?" "Because they came to me 2 years ago," she said. He stared at her. "They came to you." "A man came to my door offering to buy my property at a fair price," she said. "I told him my property was not for sale and closed the door. 3 weeks later someone cut my fence on the western side and let my cattle out. I rounded them up myself, fixed the fence, and rode into Fredericksburg the next morning and had Harrison draw up a notice of legal action against the operation, which I named by their registered land company name in the notice. That was the end of it." Ira was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You dealt with that alone," he said. "I deal with most things alone," she said. "It's not—" She stopped herself. "The point is it's manageable." "Harrison is your next step," he nodded. Then he said, "Myrtle, thank you for coming." "You'd have figured it out," she said, "but faster this way." She rode with him to Fredericksburg the next day. She had not planned to, but she had business at the land office that she had been putting off, and it made practical sense to go together. And she told herself this firmly for the entire 12-mile ride, while the morning light went from gray to gold, and the road was beautiful in the way of empty country in autumn, and Ira rode beside her with his hat pulled down against the wind and talked about his plans for the ranch, about the Hereford cattle he wanted to start with, about the improvements he had in mind for the house that was currently barely habitable, asking her questions that were real questions, and listening to her answers with the full attention she was by now quite used to and quite dependent on in ways she had not fully admitted. In Fredericksburg, at the land office, she discovered that her own deed, which she had filed 3 years ago and which had been unambiguous for those 3 years, had a recording error that her name, filed as Myrtle E. Keating, which was correct, did not match the bill of sale, which read Myrtle Keating without the middle initial, and that a clerk named Howland had flagged this discrepancy, and it needed to be resolved before the end of the month or the deed would be placed in dispute. She stood at the counter with the papers in her hand and felt the cold, particular sensation of the floor threatening to drop out from under her, and she controlled her face carefully, because she did not fall apart in public and especially not in government offices. The clerk explained the process for correction, which involved a notarized affidavit and a re-recording fee, and could take up to 2 weeks if everything was done correctly and immediately. If it was not done correctly and immediately, the timeline extended and the dispute process opened, and during a dispute the land was technically in a state of uncertain ownership, which was exactly the kind of uncertainty that a certain San Antonio land operation liked to move into. She handled it at the counter with her usual efficiency, filling out the required form and arranging for the affidavit to be witnessed that afternoon. And she did all of this with a calm she felt on the outside and not at all on the inside. And when she walked out of the land office into the cold November street, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her eyes on the middle distance and her hands very still at her sides. Ira came out of Harrison's office across the street and crossed to where she was standing and read her face with an accuracy that surprised her. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She told him plainly and without drama, the way she reported everything, and he listened and then he said, "You've already started the correction process." "Yes. I'll have the affidavit witnessed this afternoon, and the filing will be updated before the end of the week. Is there anything else that needs to be done?" "I need to write to the original bill of sale notary in Kansas for a confirmation letter, which will take 2 weeks at best and could be longer if the notary has moved or retired." She paused. "If the deed is placed in dispute before that letter arrives, I need to be prepared." "Harrison can handle that," he said. "I'll introduce you when we go back in." "I can arrange my own legal counsel," she said. "I know," he said, and there it was again, the simple acknowledgement, the same phrase in different forms. "I know you can do this. I know you don't need the help. But you're already here and Harrison already knows the situation in the county. It makes sense." She looked at him for a moment in the cold Fredericksburg street. There was something building in her chest that was not panic and was not the gratitude she was comfortable with, but something more complicated and less safe. She breathed through it. "All right," she said. They went back to Harrison's office together, and she sat across from the lawyer with Ira beside her, not speaking unless spoken to, not making her arguments for her, just present. And she made her own case clearly, and Harrison told her the same things the clerk had, and added 2 additional legal strategies she had not known about, and she left with a plan that was substantially better than the one she had going in. On the road home, in the gathering cold of the late afternoon, they rode side by side without talking for a long while. The sky had gone the color of pewter and smelled like snow, which would be unusual in November but was not impossible this far north in the Texas hill country. The horses moved steadily and she felt the silence between them as something comfortable and specific to them, a silence that had its own quality. "I was afraid today," she said. She had not planned to say it. He didn't look at her with surprise or alarm. "Of losing the land," he said. "Of losing what the land means," she said. "I know it sounds like someone who understands what they've built," he said, "and what it cost." She looked straight ahead at the road. "I came here, I had $11 and a mule and a deed I'd paid for with money I had saved without Robert Keating knowing I was saving it," she said, "because I knew before I left that I was going to leave. It just took me another year to do it." She paused. "That land is not property to me. It's the first and only thing that has ever been entirely mine." "It will remain entirely yours," he said quietly. "The legal situation is manageable. Harrison is good." "I know," she said. They rode. "Myrtle," he said. "Yes. I'm glad you came with me today." She thought about this. She thought about how she had come to check on him after the surveyor's stake incident, and how she had ridden to Fredericksburg on the pretext of business she could have done at another time, and how she had stood in the land office with his presence somewhere across the street and felt it like a compass point. She thought about Thursday suppers, and the horse named Abraham, and a note that said stubborn but honest. She thought about a man who had looked at her house and said it's a good house and meant it without any freight beyond the meaning of the words. "I'm glad I came too," she said. The snow held off, but December came and the legal situation resolved itself. The notary in Kansas had not moved or retired, and the confirmation letter arrived in 11 days. Harrison filed it promptly, and Myrtle's deed was re-recorded clean and clear and properly notarized. And she stood at her kitchen table reading the confirmation document with her coffee, and felt the particular satisfaction of a crisis handled and a thing secured. Ira's situation with the San Antonio operation resolved similarly. Harrison's notice of legal action had the same effect it had had 2 years ago when Myrtle had sent her own, and Coles was not seen in the area again. It turned out that the land operations legal position was less solid than their tactics implied, and one firm letter from a competent attorney was sufficient to make them redirect their attentions. They had supper together on the Friday that both resolutions came through, and there was a quality to that evening that was different from the previous ones, something lighter, the specific relief of two people who have been quietly carrying concern and have set it down. Myrtle made a roast chicken with preserved tomatoes from the garden and bread she had baked that morning, and Ira brought apple preserves that he said had been made by the woman who ran the boarding house and were excellent, and she had to admit they were excellent, and she said so, which made him smile. After supper they sat by the fire she had in the small stove in the sitting room, also something she had built, the surround of the stove, from flat stones quarried from the creek bed. And the room was warm, and the dark outside was the deep dark of December, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about the winter feeding schedule she became aware that they had shifted from sitting in separate chairs to sitting beside each other on the settle bench she had made from oak, which was wide enough for two people but only comfortable for two people close together. She had not tracked how this had happened. She did not believe it was accidental. She did not move away. He was talking about the Herefords he had bought the previous week, 3 heifers and a bull from a reputable breeder in the hill country, and his voice was warm with the particular pleasure of a man who has finally begun the work he has been planning for years. She was listening and watching the fire, and feeling the warmth of his arm along hers, and thinking with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who has decided to look at a thing directly. She was in love with this man. It had happened the way most important things happen, gradually and then all at once, and looking back at all the moments she could trace each step of it, the rattlesnake and the coffee and the fire and the road to Fredericksburg and every supper in between. She was in love with him, and she was not afraid of it in the way she had been afraid of it, the bone-deep animal fear of the woman who had been to Kansas. She was something else, careful, attentive, still herself, still the woman who had built this house and this herd and this life, and also, for the first time in a long time, genuinely interested in what came next. He stopped talking. He had noticed her silence. "You've gone quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She turned and looked at him. The fire was warm on her face, and his face was close and honest and open in the way it had been open since the morning he had said she was enough on her own and asked if she wanted company anyway. "About whether I am going to make an enormous mistake," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where I tell you something true and then have to live with having told it," she said. He was very still. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said. "There is no I'm not owed. I know you're not," she said. "That's not the point." She looked at the fire for a moment. "The point is that I think I want to. And that terrifies me in a way that I'm choosing to look at directly instead of away from." "What do you want to tell me?" he said, and his voice was quiet and steady, and she knew he would receive it exactly as she offered it, without inflation or deflation. "That I have been in love with you for approximately 8 weeks, she said, "and I would like to know if there is something in that for both of us." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes," and the word was simple and warm and entirely sufficient. He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is very careful because the thing being held is very important, and she kissed him back with the conviction of a woman who has made a considered decision and is standing fully behind it. December became January with a cold, clear dignity, and Dustfall watched the courtship of Myrtle Keating and Ira Finley with the fascinated attention of a small town that had been waiting for this with varying degrees of awareness. Mrs. Hutchins was said to have told 3 separate people that she had known from the start, which Myrtle found improbable and also vaguely endearing. Mr. Beaumont at the general store had taken to looking between them with an expression of such extreme satisfaction that Myrtle had finally said to him directly, "You can stop looking like that, Beaumont," and he had said, entirely unashamed, "I don't think I can, Miss Keating." She rode to his land and helped him plan the layout of his cattle operation, and he came to her for supper. And sometimes supper extended to sitting by the fire and talking until midnight. And sometimes they rode together in the mornings on no particular errand, but the company of each other in the cold winter light. She brought him to the far eastern corner of her property one January morning, the corner where the creek ran, where she had planted 3 cottonwood saplings in her first spring that had now become proper trees, bare in winter but substantial, their branches against the sky making that particular intricate pattern of dormant trees that looks like lace. She had not brought anyone to this place before. It was the place she came when she needed to think, or when she was grateful in a way that was too large for the inside of the house. "This is where I come when the land feels like mine in the best way," she said. He stood beside her and looked at the trees and the creek and the sky for a while. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said. "I wanted you to see it," she said simply. They stood together in the cold quiet, and she felt the land around her, her land, still entirely hers, not diminished by his presence but enlarged by having someone who could understand why it mattered, and she thought that this was what she had not known she was missing. Not someone to need, not someone to depend on. Someone to share the best things with, which was different, which was something she had not let herself want because wanting it had seemed like a weakness, and now seemed like the most straightforward and natural human thing imaginable. He asked her to marry him on a morning in February. Not in any grand ceremony of it. They were at her kitchen table with coffee, as they so often were, and the light was coming through the window at the angle that made the room golden, and she was reading a letter from the seed company about her spring order, and he was looking at her in a way that she felt but did not look up from immediately. And then she looked up. "I have been trying to find the right moment for this," he said, "and I have decided there is no right moment and I should simply say it." She set the letter down. "I love you," he said. "I think you know that. I love everything you've built here, and I love the way your mind works, and I love that you argued with Harrison about the affidavit language and that you were right. I love that you keep tobacco on the shelf you don't smoke because someone gave it to you and you couldn't throw it away." He paused. "I am not asking you to change anything about your life. I am asking if you would be willing to let me be part of it, as your husband, if you'll have me." She was quiet for a moment. She thought clearly and without sentimentality about what this meant. Her land was hers. She had spoken to Harrison about this specifically, not in anticipation of this moment but as a matter of practical education, and she knew that under Texas law a married woman's premarital property remained her separate property as long as it was properly documented. Her 40 acres were not at risk, but that was not what she was thinking about, not really. She was thinking about the cottonwood trees and the person she had become and the difference between isolation, which she had chosen and been right to choose, and solitude, which was chosen too but was not the same thing, and this, which was a third option she had not previously allowed herself to name. "Yes," she said. He let out a long breath, and she could see from his face that he had not been certain, that he had known she might say no and had asked anyway, and she respected that more than she could say. They married in March, at the little Methodist church in Dustfall, with the wildflowers just starting in the scrubland, and the sky that particular early spring blue that feels like a promise. The ceremony was small because Myrtle preferred small and Ira had no objections to her preferences. Mrs. Hutchins wept openly. Mr. Beaumont looked as though he might burst with vindication. Dormer attended and shook Ira's hand and said to Myrtle, "You are the most sensible woman in this county, and I mean that as the highest compliment," which she received as such. They did not move onto one property and abandon the other. This had been discussed with the practicality that characterized all their important discussions, and the solution was straightforward. They would maintain both properties as working operations, which between them they had the labor and knowledge to do, and they would live at Myrtle's house, which was larger and better built, and which she had made clear was where she intended to remain. Ira had agreed to this without qualification, having stated that her house was considerably better than his current situation, and she had believed him, and she had been right. He moved in with the quiet ease of a man who was genuinely glad to be where he was and had no investment in which property it technically was. The house, she thought, in the first weeks of marriage, had not changed. It was still the same 4 rooms, and the kitchen she had built, and the stone surround on the stove, and the window that let in the morning light at that particular golden angle. But it was different in the way that a room is different when someone you love is in it, not diminished, not altered in its essential nature, but fuller, more used, more resonant, like a bell that has finally been rung. Ira was a good partner. She had expected him to be good, but the specific quality of how he was good continued to surprise her in small ways. He did not try to take over things she had established her own methods for. He did not offer opinions on her cattle management unless she asked, and when she asked he offered opinions that were worth having. He did the hard morning work without complaint and without the particular martyrdom that some people apply to labor, just did it because it needed doing, the same way she did. He cooked on the 3 nights a week she allotted to him, which she had proposed and he had accepted, and his cooking was different from hers, spicier, more improvisational, and she found that she liked it. She learned, in the intimacy of daily life, the things that she had not yet known about him. That he woke at 4 in the morning and lay still for exactly half an hour before getting up, and that during this half hour he was thinking. She knew he was thinking because she could feel it, the particular quality of someone awake and working through a problem, and sometimes she lay beside him in the dark and thought her own thoughts, and sometimes she said, "What are you working out?" and he told her. That he had a deep and genuine kindness toward animals that expressed itself not in sentimentality but in patient attention. That he read slowly and carefully, and would read the same passage 2 or 3 times if it required it, which was a form of thoroughness she recognized and respected. That he could be silent with her for hours in a way that felt like conversation. She loved him. She loved him in a way that was not the obliterating love of very young people who lose themselves entirely, but the more powerful and more durable love of a person who is fully themselves and chooses to love from that wholeness, and who is loved back the same way. Spring on the combined property was magnificent that year, whether it was actually better than previous springs or whether it simply looked that way from inside the change in her life. She could not entirely determine and did not particularly try. The cattle on both properties came through the winter in excellent condition. The garden, which Ira had asked to help with, specifically asking, not assuming, was expanded by a 3rd, and he turned out to have a good hand with seedlings, patient and attentive in the way he was patient and attentive with everything. The cottonwood trees at the creek corner leafed out full and green and spectacular, and she took him there again in May, and they stood beside the creek in the warm afternoon, and she thought, this is the whole life. This is all of it. In July she told him she was expecting. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly, because that was how she approached things, watching his face for his true reaction, which was the only one she trusted. His face did what she had not seen it do before. It went through about 4 different expressions in rapid succession, all of them too large and too genuine to be controlled, and landed on something that was not quite joy and not quite disbelief, but was both things pressed together into one expression she did not have a word for. "Myrtle," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm being practical about it. We need to discuss the fall cattle schedule with this in mind and the—" "Myrtle," he said again, and he crossed around the table to her and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked up at her with that face, and she felt the entire carefully maintained architecture of her practicality tremble slightly. "I'm not afraid," she said, and it was the truest thing she had said in months, because she had checked herself for fear and found it absent. Not because motherhood was not complicated or enormous, but because she was Myrtle Keating Finley, and she had built a house and driven cattle and faced down a land operation, and she was not going to be afraid of a life she had, with full knowledge, invited in. "I didn't think you were," he said. "I'm a little afraid myself." "You'll be fine," she said. "You're good at patient attention." He laughed there on his knees beside her chair, the kind of full laugh that she had learned was the truest version of his happiness, and she sat at her kitchen table in the morning light that came through her window and felt the fullness of everything. The pregnancy was, in the medical language of 1882, uneventful in the lived language of a woman managing a working cattle property in central Texas. It was demanding and occasionally infuriating, and she continued to do everything she had always done at a somewhat modified pace, and with the assistance she accepted without embarrassment, because she had always accepted help when it made sense and refused it when it didn't, and this was no different. The town doctor, a careful man named Alderman who she had gradually come to trust, was satisfied with her progress at every visit. She did have one afternoon in September, when the heat came back one last time before the fall broke it, when she sat in the shade of the kitchen door and felt the immensity of what was coming and felt, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. The awareness that this was a thing beyond her control in a way that very few things in her life were, that the body did what it did regardless of her plans, and that the smallness of this feeling was something she needed to sit with. Ira found her there when he came in from the eastern fence, dusty and hot, and he looked at her for a moment and then he sat down in the shade beside her without asking what was wrong because he had learned, as she had learned, that asking what was wrong was sometimes the wrong question. "It's a strange thing," she said after a while, "building a life you can control, and then having things in it that you can't." "Yes," he said. "I don't know how to not be good at things," she said. "And I don't know yet how I will be at this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have watched you learn every single thing you've turned your attention to, the house, the cattle, the law when you needed the law. I have not yet seen you fail to become good at something you set your mind to." "This is different," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but you won't be doing it alone." She looked at him. The heat was heavy in the yard and the cattle were quiet, and somewhere down by the creek a bird was making the slow September sound of end of season, and she thought, "This is what I said I didn't need. And I was right, and also I was wrong, and both things are true at the same time, and I am large enough to hold both truths without either one canceling the other." "No," she said, "I won't be alone." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat in the shade together, and the afternoon went on around them. Their son was born in November of 1882, on a cold, clear morning that smelled like frost and the particular clean cold of a Texas winter that has finally arrived and means business. He was a large and decisive baby who arrived with the efficiency that Myrtle had hoped for and let himself be known immediately with the full volume of his opinions. Dr. Alderman pronounced him excellent in every measurable way. Mrs. Hutchins, who had appointed herself indispensable in the vicinity of the Finley house from approximately October onward, wept again, loudly and without embarrassment. Ira held his son for the first time with his back to the room, and his shoulders doing something that Myrtle watched from the bed with the particular tenderness of a woman seeing a strong person moved past the point of composure. She had been moved herself in the first moments, in a way she had not expected, and was not going to describe to anyone, a wave of something so enormous it had no name in any category she owned. They named him James. James William Finley, after Ira's father and Myrtle's own, two men who had been complicated and human and entirely unknown to each other, joined now in the name of this small, decided person who had arrived in November 1882 with his mother's stubbornness already visible in the set of his jaw, and Ira claimed his father's ears. "You cannot see his ears yet," Myrtle said. "He is 3 days old." "I can see enough," Ira said, completely unruffled. James was a healthy baby and grew into a sturdy and cheerful toddler who treated both the cattle and the garden as his personal domain from approximately the time he could walk, and had to be redirected from these pursuits with the same patient consistency his parents applied to everything. He had his mother's focus and his father's equanimity, and the combination was extraordinary to watch. Myrtle felt something she could only describe as delight, a sensation she had not expected to find in motherhood but which was there constantly, woven through the exhaustion and the work of it, sheer delight at this person, at who he was already becoming, at the specific miracle of a human being that she and Ira had made. In the spring of 1884, when James was 16 months old and testing every fence and gate on the property for weaknesses with the methodical thoroughness of a professional, Myrtle discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Ira at supper, over Ira's spicy improvised stew, and he received the news with an enormous smile, and then immediate practical inquiries about the timing relative to the fall cattle drive, which she had been thinking about herself, and they sat at the table and planned around it with the efficiency of two people who had learned to do everything together and found it, consistently, better than doing it alone. The town of Dustfall changed in those years, as towns in the territory were changing, the railroad coming closer and changing the economics of cattle and the road being improved, and new families arriving and some families leaving. Myrtle watched the changes with the steady attention of someone whose roots were deep enough that change in the landscape was interesting rather than threatening. Her land was hers, clear and unambiguous, filed correctly and maintained meticulously, and her herd had grown from 20 head to 45, a number that made her proud in the specific way of a thing accomplished through continuous careful work. Ira's property was also thriving. The Herefords he had started with had increased to a healthy herd of their own, and between the two operations, they had built a working partnership that the county looked to as an example. Dormer's long-standing fence dispute was now entirely resolved, and Dormer had become a genuine friend, a man who came to supper occasionally and argued cheerfully with Myrtle about soil improvement and occasionally about politics, in the way that people who respect each other argue about things that matter. Their daughter arrived in November 1884, 2 years after James, small and fierce and immediately opinionated. They named her Clara Nell Clara for the post-mistress who had, in fact, been a reliable presence in their lives, and Nell for Myrtle's own mother, a woman she had loved and lost early, and whose name she wanted to carry forward into this new life she was building. Clara Nell Finley arrived in the world with her eyes already open and a clear intention to observe everything, and she and James established from approximately the first week a relationship of intense mutual interest that was going to be, Myrtle saw immediately, the defining dynamic of her children's childhood. The house, which Myrtle had built for one person and expanded thoughtfully in the years since, had grown comfortable and specific in the way that houses do when they are actually lived in by people who know what they want from a space. There was a room for James and a room for Clara Nell, both rooms furnished with the functional simplicity Myrtle applied to everything, and the kitchen had been expanded by a linta she and Ira had built together the previous autumn, working side by side with the ease of two people who had long since learned each other's rhythms. On a January evening in 1885, with James asleep in his room and Clara Nell fed and settled, and the house quiet around them, Myrtle and Ira sat by the stove with the day's work behind them and the winter dark outside the windows, and Myrtle looked at her husband across the small warm space between them and thought, with the clear-eyed honesty she applied to everything, that she had been right 3 years ago when she had told him she was enough on her own. She had been right. And he had been right, too, when he said he knew that and asked if she wanted company anyway. Both things were true. She had been whole before him and she was whole now, but the wholeness now was larger, had room in it for James and Clara Nell, and for the man across from her who had carried his lamp across the dark and sat down at her table and never, not once, suggested she was less than what she was. She was enough on her own. She was also, it turned out, more than enough with him beside her. The two truths did not cancel each other. They stood together, as she and Ira stood together, each one fully themselves and choosing every morning to stand there. She had told him once, in the cold light of that first honest conversation, that she preferred not to be human about things that cost her much. He had said it sounded like a lot of work. He had been right about that too. "What are you thinking about?" he asked from across the stove. "I'm thinking about how I was right," she said. He looked at her with the patient curiosity of someone who has learned her habit of beginning sentences in the middle of her own thoughts. "Right about what specifically?" "About being enough on my own," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "You were," he said. "I was," she said. "And I'm glad I let you ask anyway." He smiled at her, the slow-starting smile that she had catalogued and loved and would know anywhere. And the fire was warm, and the house was quiet, and outside the windows her land, their land, both properties and all the work on them and all the future work they had not yet begun, lay under the January sky in the dark silence of things that are absolutely certain of what they are. She got up from her chair and crossed the small space and sat beside him on the settle bench, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the deliberate ease of a woman who has made a considered choice. And they sat together in the warm room while the winter moved around the house without getting in. In the years that followed, Dustfall grew and changed, and the territory became a state in 1890, and the world moved in all the ways that worlds move. And through all of it, Myrtle Keating, Finley remained exactly who she had always been. The woman who had built her own house and her own life, and who ran her property with the tireless efficiency of someone who understood that the land required everything you had and gave back accordingly. She added a third section to the cattle operation when James was 8 and Clara Nell was 6, purchasing a parcel to the north of her original property that she had been watching for 2 years, and she negotiated the purchase herself with the precision of someone who knew exactly what something was worth. Ira watched these negotiations from a respectful distance, which was to say he was present and available and said nothing unless she asked him, which she occasionally did when a specific practical question arose, and when she closed the deal she shook the seller's hand, and then turned to find Ira leaning against the doorframe of the land office with an expression of such undisguised pride that she felt it like sunshine. "Stop looking at me like that," she told him. "I don't think I can," he said, which was what Mr. Beaumont had said years ago and which made her laugh. James grew into a boy of remarkable intelligence and physical capability, who could work cattle and do arithmetic at a level years ahead of the schoolhouse, and who had, at age 9, already established a garden plot of his own with the same methodical persistence his mother had applied to the original garden. He wanted to know how everything worked, the land, the cattle, the legal structures of property ownership, everything. Myrtle found in him a student whose questions kept her honest, who pushed her thinking in directions she had not expected, and who sat at the kitchen table with his arithmetic slate and his mother's focused expression and his father's patient disposition, and filled the house with the particular energy of a child who is exactly where he is supposed to be. Clara Nell was different. Where James was systematic, she was intuitive. Where he planned, she improvised. She had her father's ease with animals and her mother's complete absence of self-doubt, which combined in her as something formidable and charming and occasionally alarming. By the time she was 5, she was riding her own pony with a competence that made the neighbors stare and made Myrtle feel, privately and without saying it, the specific fierce pride of seeing yourself reflected in someone who is also entirely their own person. The injustice that touched them most directly in those years was not the land pressure from outside operators, which had resolved and not recurred, but something more ambient and more difficult. The way that women's legal standing in property and business remained constrained in ways that Myrtle had to navigate constantly, and that she discussed with Ira plainly and without softening. She had to have Harrison's help on 2 additional occasions to establish her right to sign certain legal documents as a married woman in her own name, separate from her husband's, And each time she had done so with the controlled fury of a person who knows the system is wrong and works within it anyway, because the work of changing it is longer than any individual case. Ira had been, in these matters, the exact right kind of ally. He understood the injustice clearly. He did not minimize it or explain it away, and he did not make the mistake of trying to fix things that were hers to fix. He said once when she came home from a particularly frustrating encounter at the county clerk's office, "The law is wrong about women and property. It will change eventually. Until it does, you are going to have to be right more than anyone around you and document everything." She had looked at him and said, "I know," and then, "Thank you for not telling me to be patient." And he had said, "I have never advised you to be patient about anything that mattered." She remembered that exchange for years. In 1888, when Clara Nell was 3 and James was 5, and the property was in full flourishing operation, Myrtle rode to the cottonwood trees at the creek corner. The trees that were now taller than she could have imagined when she planted them, their canopy substantial and their roots deep in the creek bank. And she sat on the ground beneath them the way she had sat for years when she needed to think, or be grateful, or both. The creek made its sound. The light came through the leaves in the particular broken way of afternoon summer light. Ira had told her, when they were first married, that he was glad she had shown him this place. He came here too now, occasionally, separately, and she knew this and was glad of it. A place that is meaningful does not become less so when more than one person knows it. If anything, it becomes more and more layered, more rooted, more real. She thought about the woman she had been in 1879, $11 and a mule and a deed, and the woman she was now, and she considered both versions with the honest eye of someone who respects the person they were and the person they have become. She had not abandoned anything, she had added to it. The solitude that had saved her had done its work, and she had grown beyond it, not leaving it behind, but carrying it forward as a form of self-knowledge. The knowledge that she could stand alone, and had chosen not to because the not alone was better, and that was neither a weakness nor a betrayal of the woman who had come to Dustfall with her hands and her will and nothing else. The year 1890 brought Texas statehood and the particular upheaval of a territory becoming a state, with all the legal and political reorganization that implied, and Myrtle spent a considerable amount of time that year at the county offices, and in correspondence with Harrison, ensuring that her property registrations and deed records were properly transferred into the new state system, which they were, cleanly and without dispute. Because she had maintained everything in perfect order for years, and she was not going to let a reorganization of governance introduce ambiguity into something she had worked this hard to secure. She was 36 years old in 1890, and she was in the fullness of things: her land, her herd, her children, her marriage, herself. She sat on her porch on the evening of statehood, which was widely celebrated in Dustfall, with a bonfire in the town square that she could see the glow of from her property, and she had a glass of good whiskey, and she was quiet. Ira came and sat beside her. The children were inside, asleep. The night was cool and very clear. "We are in a state now," he said. "We are," she said. "Does it feel different?" "The land doesn't know the difference," she said, "but I suppose the law does." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together in the clear October night with the distant glow of the bonfire, and the very large and very close dark of the sky over them. A sky that was the same sky it had always been, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and entirely indifferent to things like statehood and property lines, and the particular human miracle of two people who had found each other and built something worth building. She was enough on her own. She had always been enough on her own. That remained true on this night as it had been true on every night since she had driven into Dustfall with Goliath and her deed and her silence. And she had wanted the company, and the company had been the right choice. And she was glad every single day in the particular and unshowy way that she was glad about things, in the way that she had always been glad about things, practically, deeply, without sentiment but with complete and honest fullness, glad that she had said yes when he had asked. Not because she needed him to be complete, but because completeness, she had learned, could be added to without being subtracted from, and because life at its fullest included, alongside solitude and capability and the fierce pride of building your own house with your own hands, the warm weight of someone you love beside you in the dark, and the sound of your children sleeping in the rooms you built, and the land outside your window that is yours and that you know in your bones, and the cottonwood trees at the creek corner that are taller every year, and the whole long, beautiful, unfinished work of a life that is entirely, completely, and stubbornly your own.